off the famous Powell High Street cable car in San Francisco, and we've gone up and down all sorts of hills, and now we've come out at the top of Lombard Street, the famous San Francisco street that zigzags all the way down to the bottom, and we've got a view right across the bay to the Golden Gate Bridge as well, and it's just amazing. And I've come here to see the famous Philip Zimbardo, the man who did the Stanford prison experiment.
8612, against the wall. Against the wall. 416, while they do push-ups, you sing Amazing Grace. Ready? Down. Amazing Keep going. Grace. Keep doing push-ups on your own.
You really felt like you were a prisoner. You know, it may be Zimbardo's experiment and maybe you were getting paid for it, but damn it, you were a prisoner.
No, I gotta go. To a doctor, anything. I can't see now. I don't know how to explain it. No!
Prisoners suffer. There's no question about it, and I am responsible for it. I still feel guilty about it. But there was probably more gain from this study than almost any other study I know.
The demonstration that apparently ordinary people could do extraordinarily bad things, it opened us up to something many people were beginning to think about, the power of the situation, but also what constitutes evil. How much is evil something inside of you and me? How much of it is in the situation?
Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819.
It wasn't a new idea. It was a powerful demonstration of an idea that maybe is the core idea of modern social psychology, which is the importance of social context and social meaning.
The Stanford prison experiment, where Philip Zimbardo set up a fake prison in the university basement, is one of the most famous psychology experiments ever done. And little did anyone know that this experiment would foretell the events that would happen over 30 years later in a real prison in Iraq.
An American military judge has ruled that the head of U.S. forces in Iraq, General Ricardo Sanchez, may be summoned to testify at the trial of soldiers charged with abusing prisoners at the Abu Ghraib prison in Baghdad. They've admitted...
For Phil Zimbardo, the news about Abu Ghraib felt spookily familiar.
I'm looking at these pictures, and they're horrifying, shocking, but they're not at all surprising. And suddenly here's this shock of recognition. I said, oh my God. Here are the guards putting bags over the prisoners' head. Here's the guards stripping prisoners naked. Here's the guards getting prisoners to engage in sexually degrading activities. I had seen all of those before. I have those pictures in my slideshow.
Well, when sixes, you got your hands in the air. Why don't you play Frankenstein? 293, you can be the bride of Frankenstein, and you be Frankenstein. I want you to walk over here like Frankenstein and say that you love 293.
After what happened at Stanford University, strict ethical guidelines for psychology experiments were brought in, and there would never be an experiment like this again. When Phil Zimbardo set up his experimental prison in August 1971, he wasn't the world-famous social psychologist he's since become. He was a somewhat flamboyant lecturer in the Stanford Psychology Department in the town of Palo Alto, 35 miles south of San Francisco. But as he got the basement ready, replacing lab doors with steel bars, he had no idea what was about to happen in the next 6 days.
I had been doing research on anonymity and de-individuation, coming out of actually The Lord of the Flies, the William Golding book. I always use role-playing experiences. In a class I was teaching on social psychology, I asked kids if they were interested in creating a mock prison, where kids would be prisoners and guards. And a group of them did over the weekend in their dorm. And it had had this profound effect on them. Kids were crying, saying, you can't be my friend anymore, the terrible things you did to me. He said, no, that wasn't me. I was playing the role of guard. They said, no, that's the real you. And either that experience is really very powerful, or maybe the weird kids in the class chose to do that project. It's only by doing an experiment where we randomly assign them to be prisoners and guards, so they don't choose that, and we record and document everything that happens, can we answer the question, is it something about the situation or something about the people? And that was the reason to do the study. It was really following up a class exercise.
The 24 male college students who took part in the study were given psychometric tests to check they were all mentally healthy, and then they were randomly assigned to be prisoners or guards. The whole thing hinged on making the experience as authentic as possible. So somehow, Zimbardo even persuaded the local Palo Alto police to play a very special part in the experiment.
cop comes to the front door, and right there, they took me out the door. They put my hands against the car. It was a real cop car. It was a real policeman, and there were real neighbors in the street who didn't know this was an experiment.
The arrest by the police was critical. If the experiment began by having college students come to the laboratory and say, I'm here for the experiment, if they voluntarily surrendered their freedom, they always knew they could take it back. And that's not what happens in real life. The arrests were as realistic as could be. That set the tone immediately. So the kids who were going to be prisoners, they didn't know what role they were in. We simply said, wait at home or wait in their dormitories or come to this particular place. Suddenly a squad car pulls up, the siren is wailing, cop gets out, says, I want to see Billy Jones. You're wanted for violation of Penal Code 459 PC, armed robbery or breaking and entry, whatever. You have the right to remain silent. And they take them down to the real police station. They fingerprint them. They do a whole booking. And you're sitting alone in a squad car with your handcuffs. Your freedom has just been stripped away from you.
So this is the ground floor of the psychology department. It's Jordan Hall at Stanford. It's a building right in the middle of the campus. It has a very imposing position.
So we're going to walk down to the basement.
Harry Bowman is the building manager, so you're going to show me downstairs. So this is the basement corridor here, and it says laboratories.
Prisoners were brought in by the Palo Alto Police Department. They were brought in through the doors you see here on our right-hand side, blindfolded to the Stanford County Prison. We actually had cell doors installed on these 3 rooms here and then several down the way. The closets you see on the side were actually used as solitary confinement for some of the prisoners.
I was the first one to be picked up, so they put me in a cell, which is just like a room with a door with bars on it. They locked me in there in this degrading little outfit. They were taking this experiment too seriously.
Most of my research has worked because I put enormous attention to every detail. And so in the prison study, the guards and the staff were wearing these silver reflecting sunglasses, an idea I got from the movie Cool Hand Luke with Paul Newman. And the guards are going to be in military uniforms, which are going to automatically give them status. The prisoners are going to be in smocks, meaning just canvas dresses, if you will, with no underpants, and with Boy Scout numbers sewn on by my secretary's daughter. And the reason for that is the system tries to emasculate men. Because men are going there who are violent, who are impulsive, and they are a danger to the guards.
Well, when 6 inches, you got your hands in the air. Why don't you play Frankenstein? This is correct. 293, you can be the bride of Frankenstein. You stand here.
You really become that person. Once you put on that khaki uniform, you put on the glasses, you take the nightstick, and you act the part.
You smile, 293. You get down here and do 10 push-ups. 2.
The guards would make them do push-ups here in the corridor. There are restrooms right around the corner on the left side here. I do believe the guards, as a form of punishment, had them cleaning the restrooms.
Yes, because they had to clean the loos with their bare hands as one of the unpleasant things they made them do.
You can see, I'll open up one office here so you can see the sides. This, of course, is now a postdoc's office, but...
yeah, this must be about sort of 8 foot across and 12 foot long.
Yes.
But it's clearly a study for 1 or 2 people. This would have had 3 prisoners in it. It is small.
This is the wall where we actually had the calendar, which was scratched into the wall by one of the prisoners, counting the days that the prisoner had been held.
It was really a prison. There's no way I can describe how I felt. I just felt totally hopeless. More hopeless than I'd ever felt before.
It was a prison to me. It still is a prison to me. I don't look on it as an experiment or a simulation. It was just a prison that was run by psychologists instead of run by the state. I began to feel that that identity, that the person that I was that had decided to go to prison was remote until finally I wasn't that. I was 416. I was really my number. And 416 was going to have to decide what to do.
Now, if 416 does not want to eat his sausages, then you can give me the blankets and sleep on the bare mattress, or you can keep your blankets and 416 will stay in another day. Now, what would it be?
We got 3 in favor of keeping your blankets.
We got 3 against 1. Keep your blankets, 416, you're going to be in there for a while. So just get used to it.
So as you can see here, there's probably 3 feet, 4 feet of space in this closet where the prisoners were kept in solitary confinement.
This is horrible. This really is small. I mean, you've opened these giant doors here, and there's this cupboard, and there are now it's got 3 filing cabinets in it, but it's only as deep as a filing cabinet would be. That's really nasty and presumably dark. And
right, there are no lights in there whatsoever.
That's shocking. What's even more shocking is that nobody stopped this experiment. It was supposed to last for 2 weeks, but by just day 5, 4 students had suffered breakdowns and had to be released. It wasn't even as if Zimbardo was keeping it secret. In his quest for authenticity, he introduced visiting hours for parents, brought in a prison chaplain, and even found a real ex-prisoner to chair the parole board hearing. Somehow they all got caught up in the situation Phil Zimbardo had created, and they went along with it. And he was so caught up in it himself that he made a fundamental error. Instead of remaining an objective observer, he had taken a role in his own experiment.
I made a big mistake. I was the principal investigator, but I also made myself the superintendent of the prison. And that was a huge tactical error. It should have been somebody else.
I was really surprised that the priest didn't do anything about it, that the priest went along with it so much and even rang one of the mothers of one of them and said you need to get him a lawyer to try and get him out. But I think that's almost as shocking as what the guards did, that someone coming in like the priest, who knows it's an experiment, didn't try and stop what was going on.
And again, the parents come down. When this woman, I still remember, Mrs. Yacko, comes after visiting hours with her husband to see me in the superintendent's quarters and says, "Oh, it's interesting what you're doing, but I don't mean to make trouble, but I've never seen my son looking so terrible." Well, I switch into the superintendent. Anybody says I don't mean to make trouble has the potential for making trouble. They're going to shut this down. So she's hinting that it's something about the situation, which I know is what's doing it. I make it dispositional. I say, "What's your son's problem?" And she says, "Well, he hasn't been sleeping." I say, "Has insomnia? Doesn't he sleep?" No, he says you wake them up all hours of the night to do counts. And I turn to the husband, I say, "Mr. Yacko, don't you think your boy can handle it?" There's an immediate bond. What is he going to say? "No, my boy's..." He said, "Of course he can handle it. He's the captain of the bum. I get up, I shake his hand, I say, "I hope to see you back next week." "Oh, yeah, you're doing good stuff." And they leave. The mother, I still have the letter. The mother writes to me the next day, saying, "It's really interesting, but essentially I still want to say, my son looked terrible. He had a nervous breakdown that night." So she was absolutely right. It's one of the most repulsive things I did.
I wasn't shocked and I wasn't alarmed, but I didn't perhaps see some of the most extreme things, and I certainly didn't see any evidence personally of the changes in the prisoners and in their sense of security.
As someone working in the psychology department at Stanford University, Professor Lee Ross was invited to see parts of the experiment.
What I saw looked like folks involved in a kind of very intense play acting in which the line between pretending and enacting got very, very blurred.
They were quite creative, though, weren't they? I mean,
they were very creative.
They weren't just doing what they were told. They thought of all sorts of horrible things to do to people.
Well, they were not so much horrible. They were creative using the tools that are available to them. So these were college students, and most of the bad things they did were some combination of things they had seen in prison movies and things that they knew about or experienced from college fraternity hazing. A lot of it looked like hazing. The emphasis on embarrassment, some of the emphasis on sexuality and crudeness.
Hazing's not a word we use, that like initiation.
Initiation, right, the pranks, to show you were a good fellow, that you could take it.
So did you ever think at any time this ought to be stopped?
I don't recall thinking it should be stopped because it was dangerous. If I had any reservations at that time, It may have been, should there be more instruction, should there be more delineating of what the roles were. Phil likes to say he didn't do anything to encourage this behavior, and that's absolutely correct. But doing nothing isn't neutral. And so normally people in a position of authority do certain things. They set down rules. They say you may do this, you may not do this. They monitor, they punish, they intervene. And so creating a situation where there was lots of ambiguity and room for improvisation, that I think encouraged the guards in Phil's experiment, but I think in the real world too, encourages people to push, to test the limits, because no one's intervening, no one's stopping them.
Any respect that might have been present, I just shut out. Then I began to treat them as coldly as possible, as harshly as possible. And by the third day, I had done such a good job convincing myself that I was acting like that. I treated the prisoners like they were of a distinct, inferior order than myself.
And so the priest doesn't stop the experiment, the lawyers don't stop it, the other psychologists don't stop it, even the parents sort of go along with it as well. But in the end, one person did put a stop to it.
A young woman named Christina Maslach, who had just graduated, was about to start a job as a professor of psychology at Berkeley, and we had recently started dating. I was very much in love with her, but didn't tell her anything about the study. And so she comes down on Thursday. It's now day 5. It started on Sunday, August 14th, 1971. At 10 o'clock was lights out. Prisoners made a last toilet run. So I said, once they go to sleep, we'll go out to have dinner. I need a break from this. And she comes down, and the toilet run was the guards lined up all the prisoners, put bags over their heads, chains on one leg to the other, and a hand on each other's shoulder, and then marched them through the prison. And I say, help Chris, look at this. And she looks and looks away, and she's tearing, and she runs outside. I run after her. And I'm saying, what's wrong with you? This is dynamic, human behavior in action, the crucible of human nature, whatever. And she says, I don't want to see anymore. It's awful. I'm not sure I want to continue having a relationship with you if this is what you're really like. That stopped me in my tracks. And I took a deep breath. I said, oh my God, she's right. In those 5 days, I could look at this suffering, and I had acclimated to that evil. It's what happens. It's the routine. At 10 o'clock, bags over the head, chains, da-da-da-da. And she's coming at this fresh and saying, no, this is a madhouse. How could you allow this to happen? You're the senior person. These are all students. I said, you're right. We have to end the study.
And he did, the next day. And later on, he even married Christina Maslach, the woman brave enough to stop him. Zimbardo claims that because the students were healthy beforehand, once out of the situation, they all bounced back and none suffered long-term effects. And amazingly, no one sued him. Perhaps a sign of the less litigious world of 1971. 2 years later, he published the Stanford prison experiment, not in the usual place, a psychology journal, but in the New York Times magazine.
I try to go beyond the usual narrow academic outlets, namely put it in a journal, psychologists say, gee, you didn't have the right control group, it wasn't systematic, etc., etc. You didn't use the best measures. In fact, they still criticize it.
The received understanding is that the Stanford Prison Study shows that people will conform blindly to role if they're put in groups and given power.
Alex Haslam, Professor of Social and Organisational Psychology at Exeter University, ran a similar experiment in 2002, which was shown on BBC One and became known as the BBC Prison Experiment.
Actually, there wasn't any evidence, I think, of blind conformity to role in the study because, and this is the critical point, the guards in the study were given explicit instructions by Zimbardo to behave indecently or, to a certain extent, brutally towards the prisoners. So to the extent that they subsequently did that, that was not about blind conformity. It was about other things like leadership, influence, and identification with Zimbardo.
Now, Zimbardo did tell them that they're not allowed to physically hurt the prisoners.
Yes, he did. Yes,
and
he did.
Didn't tell them them specific mean things to do. I mean, they came up with these really cruel things themselves, didn't they?
Definitely. There's no question about that. What I think is pretty clear is that when they behaved imaginatively and brutally, Zimbardo did not interfere and say, you should stop this.
Now, one of the main areas of criticism that the experiment receives is on ethical grounds. Why was it so wrong what was done with these students? I mean, they all consented, didn't they? They all said they were going to take part in this experiment. They didn't have to do it.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. One is that there have been very, very few studies which had looked at negative social behaviour in such an intensive way. And I think, in a way, the ethics and guidelines that were in place at that time were just not up to the task of dealing with the situation that Zimbardo had created. There was no external monitoring of the situation. Everything was down to Zimbardo's judgment. And as he himself has conceded, his judgment was clouded by the role that he himself played in the study. When we did our own study with the BBC, one of the starting points for the ethical framework was to set up an independent ethics panel watching over the study and with the power to halt it at any point in time.
Certainly the Stanford Prison Study went through a human subjects committee. The problem is what you know in anticipation from hindsight. In anticipation, the committee says, sure, it's kids playing cops and robbers. It's an experiment. They could leave at any time, of course. Afterwards, you say, how could we have allowed that to happen? Well, the whole point is you do not know what you would do except when you're in that situation. The big issue now is that the pendulum has swung so far to the right that they allow almost no behavioral research. There's certainly nothing of this kind, but nothing even approximating it. The easy way out is to do all of your research with paper and pencil scenarios. So the research would be, imagine you're a guard in the following situation. Which of the following things would you do? I would abuse prisoners. I would not abuse prisoners. I would be a good guard.
There was an experiment that's a bit like yours that was done a few years ago that's become known as the BBC prison experiment because it was shown on the BBC. I was wondering what you made of it, because it has very different results from yours in that the guards didn't do anything particularly bad, and in fact the guards didn't really bond at all.
The BBC study is a disgrace. I've actually written an article in the British Journal of Social Psychology criticizing it throughout the whole experiment because they wanted good video and good audio. Everyone knew at every moment they were in a BBC movie. Prisoners issue the rules. Guards cannot come into their cell without permission. They want better food, etc., etc. And so it was the guards who were stressed more than the prisoners. There was never a sense of the intensity that we created in the Stanford Prison Study. There was never a sense that these were meaningful roles to them.
Being a prison officer is one of the most stressful occupations one can have. And again, we saw very high levels of stress amongst our guards.
Now, I'm sure this won't come as a great surprise to you, but when I asked Zimbardo what he thought of the BBC prison experiment, his words were that he hated it, I'm afraid. He thought that there were all sorts of problems with it, and that it's not surprising that people didn't behave badly, because for a start, they knew they were on TV, so they're not going to abuse each other, are they?
I think that's part of the analysis of why those things didn't occur. But the first thing is that shows that behaviour or conformity to brutal roles is not natural. That's a term that Zimbardo uses, and it's not blind. People think about the implications of what they're doing. The idea that prison guards just go around willy-nilly brutalising people just for the sake of it because they have those uniforms and those roles just doesn't stack up. So yes, of course Zimbardo hates our study because it shines a very penetrating light on the limitations of his own work.
But 35 years after he did his study, we see the pictures of Abu Ghraib, which is so remarkably similar to some of the things that happened in his study. So he must be sort of onto something there.
No.
What he says were good people will do bad things.
I think the demonstration that decent people will do indecent things is a very significant and important point, and one I wholeheartedly endorse. Of course, things like Abu Ghraib happen. Of course, the events that he witnessed in his study occur. It's not about saying one is true and one is untrue. They both occur, and the challenge is to understand when people are subjected to tyranny and oppression and they conform to those kinds of roles. But on the other hand, also, for every tyranny that's ever existed, there has always existed a more or less successful resistance movement, and understanding the interplay between those forces is something which his own analysis singularly fails to do. He's presented us with an important picture, but it's limited and it's one-sided.
It may not have been the perfect experiment, but there must have been something in it, given the uncannily similar pictures of the abuses at Abu Ghraib. And Zimbardo even appeared as an expert witness in defence of one of the accused, explaining how a situation that's bad enough can make even good men do bad things. The Stanford prison experiment has ensured long-term fame for Philip Zimbardo, but within psychology, it's his flamboyant teaching style which is really famous. This is a man who's been known to turn up to give lectures wearing a sparkly suit and a top hat.
Here's a guy who does hypnosis in class, and he's done a lot of very dramatic, showy things, and this was, I think, seen as Phil doing the kind of thing that made him a famous teacher.
At the time, did you have any idea this was going to become a classic study?
Well, I knew it was going to be an important part of Zimbardo's lectures from now on. I didn't think it would become a classic study in terms of psychological theory, and in a sense, really, it hasn't. It is a classic in a particular important tradition in social psychology, which is the tradition of the demonstration experiment, where you try and capture a slice of life in the laboratory and then draw conclusions from it.
Was there a sense in that it fits in with Phil Zimbardo's personality, that he was the prison superintendent, so in effect he starred in his own play?
Absolutely. He was the Magus. He was Prospero. He was the magician who set in motion all the action of the play.
I think it was a watershed experiment. The demonstration that apparently ordinary people could do extraordinarily bad things if the circumstances or the context was changed was riveting. It opened us up to something many people were beginning to think about, the power of the situation, but also what constitutes evil. How much is evil something inside of you and me? How much of it is in the situation?
I come to meet Jim Breckenridge, who's Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioural Sciences at Stanford. Do you think that Phil Zimbardo is someone who very much wants to change the world through social psychology and through his research?
Absolutely. Without a doubt. I mean, for the last 5 years, we've co-taught a class on the psychology of terrorism and fear management. And the people that we teach are all actively employed in Homeland Security. They're not young students. And we've always gotten really terrific feedback. And I pride myself that I get high ratings. But the feedback for Phil's classes are, this is the single best lecture of my life. This lecture changed my life. So he wants to connect with the students. He wants to not just engage them, but change them.
And he has quite a distinctive style of his own as well, doesn't he? I mean, he's got this black hair and a black beard. And I mean, the first time I met him, I thought he almost looked sort of like you might expect a lion tamer to look. Or
I'm very fond of him, but I'm one of many people, including his wife, who from time to time exert a moderating influence.
Is it frustrating for you that people are still so interested in this experiment when you've had a whole career since looking at all sorts of subjects like shyness and your work on hypnosis and all sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to have my legacy, which I know it will be, is on my tombstone, he was the superintendent of the Stanford prison experiment. I've had these several whole lines of research that are, relatively ignored compared to ye old Stanford prison experiment.